Welcome, fellow wanderer of Gotham's darkest corners, to a long and quiet reckoning with something most people prefer not to examine too carefully, not the Joker's crimes, which are well documented, and not his defeats, which Batman's legend depends upon, but the victories. The moments when the clown who was supposed to lose actually won, and the specific ways in which those victories were more complete and more lasting than any conventional understanding of winning and losing in Gotham allows. So, settle in. Let your breathing slow and the darkness of this particular night hold you gently as we move together through the full and honest accounting of what the Joker actually achieved, and what that achievement reveals about the world he spent his existence contesting. Section 2. The Architecture of a Villain's Victory. Understanding what winning means for the Joker before any individual victory can be properly understood. The framework within which the Joker understood winning needs to be established, because the framework is not the framework that the standard vocabulary of criminal success and heroic defeat provides. And applying the wrong framework to the available evidence produces the wrong conclusions with a consistency that the Joker himself would have found instructive. The standard framework treats the Joker's victories and defeats in terms of immediate tactical outcomes. The scheme succeeds or it fails. The hostages are freed or they are not. The Batman stops the plan or he arrives too late. The villain is captured or he escapes. In this framework, the Joker's career is a record of spectacular defeats, interrupted by brief and provisional successes, a history of elaborate plans, dismantled by a more capable opponent across decades of conflict that never produced the outcome the elaborate plans were supposedly designed to achieve. This reading is available. It is also, in the most important sense, entirely wrong. It is wrong not because the tactical details are incorrect. The Batman did stop most of the schemes. The immediate harms were in most cases prevented or limited. The Joker was in fact captured and contained with a regularity that no other account of his career can ignore. It is wrong because it measures the Joker's success against objectives that were not the Joker's objectives, applies the metric of a standard criminal enterprise to an enterprise that was not, at any level of its actual design, standard. The Joker's worldview, as expressed across the Arkham games, and most completely articulated in the specific interactions with Batman that the games document in the asylum cell, in the steel mill, in the hallucinatory conversations of the Arkham Knight events, where his voice continued from inside rather than outside. Batman's psychology was organized around a proposition that was simultaneously simple, devastating. Sanity was a collective delusion. The moral architecture of the world, the distinction between good and evil, the value of innocent life, the legitimacy of the institutions organized around the protection of that life, the specific code that Batman had constructed as the organizing principle of his existence, was not a description of the world's actual structure, but a construction maintained by the mutual agreement of people who found the construction preferable to the alternative being what the Joker was, not a malfunction of the moral system, but a demonstration of what lay beneath it, the thing that appeared when the construction was subjected to sufficient pressure and revealed to be a construction rather than a foundation. Victory, in this framework, was not the acquisition of anything. It was not money, which the Joker demonstrably did not need and consistently failed to hoard when circumstances placed it in his hands. It was not territory, which he controlled temporarily and abandoned without apparent regret when his operational requirements moved elsewhere. It was not the death of his enemies, including Batman, toward whose continued existence he maintained the specific relationship of someone who required the opposition in order for the argument to have a target. Victory was the demonstration, the specific, evidenced, undeniable, showing that the construction was exactly as fragile as he had always claimed, that the order imposed by will and convention and the sustained effort of people like Batman was imposed rather than inherent, and that the specific combination of intelligence and willingness to apply pressure in the right places was sufficient to reveal this truth to anyone with the capacity and the courage to look at what the pressure had uncovered. Every scheme the Joker devised was, in his own understanding of what he was doing, not a criminal enterprise, but a philosophical experiment. The specific parameters of the scheme, the mechanism of harm, the scale of the threat, the specific pressure points being targeted were the experimental design, and the outcome of the experiment was not determined by whether Batman stopped the immediate harm, but by what the experiment had demonstrated about the nature of the world, regardless of whether the immediate harm occurred. If the harm was prevented, the experiment had demonstrated that preventing it required everything Batman had and more, had pushed the world's most prepared individual to his absolute operational limits, had consumed every resource and every ally and every contingency available, had required the specific extraordinary effort that revealed the ordinary fragility of the order that the extraordinary effort was protecting. If the harm was not prevented, the demonstration was more direct. Either way, the data had been collected. Either way, the thesis had been tested and not refuted. Either way, the Joker had learned something, and the learning was the point. This is why the standard framework produces the wrong conclusions. The standard framework asks whether the scheme succeeded. The relevant question is whether the experiment produced the data it was designed to produce. And the answer to that question was almost always yes, because an experimental design, sophisticated enough to require Batman's complete capabilities to defeat, was an experimental design that had already generated its primary datum before the defeat occurred, which was the datum of what those complete capabilities looked like when they were genuinely required, rather than merely deployed as a precaution. The difference between the Joker's schemes and the Joker's victories is therefore a distinction of levels between the immediate operational objective and the deeper philosophical objective that the immediate operation was, serving whether or not it achieved its stated aim. Arkham Asylum's immediate objective was the Titan program, the transformation of the facility's population into an army of enhanced individuals capable of overwhelming Batman's physical capability. The demonstration that a single evening's preparation could turn the most secure psychiatric institution in Gotham into a war zone. This objective was defeated. Batman dismantled the Titan program and contained the situation with the specific competence that a lifetime of preparation had produced in him. The deeper objectives of the Arkham Asylum evinced the corruption of Harley Quinn across months of therapeutic sessions before a single scheme was initiated, the acquisition of Batman's operational profile through the sustained observation of his responses to calibrated pressure, the demonstration to every watching institution and every watching citizen of Gotham that the asylum was insufficient to contain what it claimed to contain, were achieved regardless of the tactical outcome, because they were objectives whose achievement did not depend on the tactical outcome and had in several cases been achieved before the tactical engagement began. This distinction will organize the entire accounting that follows, not the schemes, the victories the schemes produced that Batman's tactical success could not undo. The specific categories of Joker victory available within the Arkham universe are not infinite, but they are distinct, and understanding their specific characters is necessary for understanding why they were as durable as they proved to be. The first category is victory through transformation, the conversion of other people, whether ally or enemy or bystander, into evidence of the Joker's thesis about what human beings become when sufficient pressure is applied to the specific vulnerabilities that the Joker had, the specific intelligence to identify, and the specific ruthlessness to exploit, without hesitation or qualification. Harley Quinn was the most complete single expression of this category, and her transformation will be examined in detail in the next section. But the category extended far beyond a single person, to include every individual whose encounter with the Joker produced in them a change that persisted after the encounter ended, a change in their understanding of what they were capable of, a change in the specific moral or psychological framework that organized their behavior, a change that the Joker had designed to produce, and that the person's own subsequent history demonstrated had been produced with the precision of someone who understood exactly what he was doing to them. The second category is victory through demonstration, the public or private exposure of the gap between what Batman's world claimed to be and what the Joker's experiments revealed it to be. The gap between the claimed impenetrability of Arkham Asylum and the demonstrated reality of a single evening's takeover. The gap between the claimed adequacy of Gotham's institutional response to its most dangerous citizens and the demonstrated reality of what those institutions became when subjected to the specific kind of pressure that the Joker was uniquely equipped to apply. The gap between the claimed moral superiority of Batman's method and the demonstrated reality of the specific compromises that method produced in the specific circumstances the Joker had the specific genius to construct. These demonstrations were victories not because of their immediate consequences, which Batman typically managed with sufficient competence to limit the immediate harm, but because of their permanent addition to the historical record, the specific evidence, now existing and non-erasable, of what the world had revealed about itself when the Joker had applied the appropriate pressure. The third category is victory through infection, the specific mechanisms by which the Joker's philosophy, his personality, and eventually his literal biology propagated themselves into the people and institutions around him in ways that persisted beyond any individual scheme's defeat. The infection of Batman's bloodstream with the contaminated transfusion that organized the Arkham City events was the most literal expression of this category. But the category extended to every person who carried the Joker's philosophical influence forward into their subsequent existence. Harley Quinn's continued operations, the Joker-influenced criminals of the Arkham Knight events, the specific changes to Gotham's institutional culture produced by years of being organized around the management of the Joker's particular form of threat. The fourth category is victory through legacy, the changes to Gotham's landscape, to Batman's psychology, and to the broader human community of the Arkham universe that the Joker's presence produced and that his death did not undo. The Joker who died at the end of Arkham City left behind a city, a Batman, and a set of institutions that were all fundamentally different from what they had been before his career, different in ways that reflected the specific victories he had achieved, different in ways that his death could not reverse because they were changes to the physical and psychological landscape of a world that continued to exist and to be organized around the evidence of what he had demonstrated. These categories are not mutually exclusive. The most significant of the Joker's victories typically operated across multiple categories simultaneously, achieving, through a single extended operation, the transformation of individuals, the demonstration of institutional fragility, the infection of the surrounding world with elements of the Joker's own psychology, and the permanent alteration of the conditions within which Batman would be required to operate for the remainder of his career. Understanding them as categories is not an exercise in taxonomic tidiness, but a mechanism for seeing clearly what the individual victories achieved and why they were as durable as they proved to be in the specific world of the Arkham universe. What none of these categories requires, it is worth noting, is that the Joker be right in his ultimate philosophical claim. The victories can be real, can represent genuine and lasting changes to genuine people and genuine institutions in a genuine world, without requiring that the conclusion the Joker drew from them be accepted. That the construction was fragile does not mean the construction was empty. That sufficient pressure could reveal its limits did not mean that the limits, once revealed, made the construction worthless or make the effort of maintaining it futile. These distinctions will become important again at the end of the accounting, when the full body of evidence has been assembled and the question of what it actually proves can be addressed with the specificity it deserves. For now, what matters is understanding that the victories were real, that their reality persisted beyond the tactical defeats that accompanied most of them, and that the accounting of them requires the patience to look past the immediate outcomes toward the deeper and more durable changes that the immediate operations were designed to produce, whether or not their immediate objectives were achieved. The Joker understood this better than anyone else in Gotham. The Batman understood it, in his own way, better than he was always able to acknowledge. The accounting that follows attempts to understand it with the honesty that both of them, in their different ways, would have recognized as the only form of engagement with the subject worth undertaking. Section 3. The First Victory. Harleen Quinzel and the Creation of Harley Quinn. The corruption of Dr. Harleen Quinzel was not the Joker's most dramatic victory, in the sense of being the most visible or the most immediately consequential in terms of the immediate harm it produced. It did not involve the takeover of an institution, or the infection of a city's water supply, or the near destruction of a man who had dedicated his existence to preventing exactly that kind of near destruction. It was quiet, in the way that the most complete victories often are quiet, conducted in the specific privacy of a therapeutic relationship, behind closed doors, in a facility that was designed to protect its patients' confidentiality, documented in session notes that were altered before anyone with the authority to act on them had the opportunity to read them accurately, visible to the people who should have been watching only after the watching had ceased to be useful. But the quietness of the process should not obscure the completeness of the outcome, because what the Joker achieved through Harleen Quinzel was something that no subsequent operation in his career exceeded in terms of the specific character of the victory. It represented the complete redirection of a trained professional's entire formation from the purpose it had been built to serve toward the purpose that the Joker's thesis required it to serve, accomplished not through coercion but through conviction, not through breaking a person but through persuading them to understand themselves differently. Harleen Quinzel arrived at Arkham Asylum carrying the specific professional formation that the best available psychiatric training could produce in someone who had applied themselves to that training, with the specific combination of genuine intellectual capability and genuine professional ambition that her academic record reflected. She was not a generalist who had ended up in criminal psychiatry by institutional accident. She had pursued the specialization deliberately, had chosen to focus her doctoral research on the specific psychological profiles of criminal offenders, had developed before her clinical placement at Arkham a theoretical framework for understanding the relationship between trauma and criminal behavior that was sophisticated enough to have attracted the attention of supervisors who recognized in her the specific kind of analytical intelligence that the field's most difficult cases required. She understood, at the level of genuine intellectual comprehension, rather than merely professional warning, that the patients she would encounter in her clinical placement were manipulative in ways that most patients were not, that the specific intelligence and the specific absence of normal social constraint that characterized the population of Arkham's most dangerous residents made the therapeutic relationship a more complicated and more dangerous undertaking than it was in most clinical contexts. She had been warned about this. She had internalized the warning. She had arrived at the facility with what she understood to be the appropriate degree of professional distance and the appropriate set of clinical tools for maintaining it. The specific problem that the Joker represented, the problem that no amount of professional preparation had equipped her to address, was not the problem of manipulation in the conventional clinical sense. The conventional clinical concern about manipulative patients was the concern about patients who would attempt to use the therapeutic relationship to achieve practical goals, to obtain information useful for a subsequent escape attempt, to generate documentation supporting a legal challenge to their commitment, to establish a relationship with a staff member that could be exploited for access to contraband or communication with the outside world. The clinical training that addressed this concern was training in the recognition and management of specific interpersonal strategies, the recognition of flattery as a manipulation tactic, the maintenance of consistent professional boundaries, that prevented the escalation of therapeutic intimacy beyond the level the relationship required. The documentation practices that preserved an accurate record of the patient's behavior and the therapist's responses in ways that could be reviewed by supervisors who could identify patterns invisible from inside the relationship. None of this was relevant to what the Joker was doing. The Joker was not attempting to manipulate Harleen Quinzel in the sense of trying to get something from her, some specific practical benefit that the therapeutic relationship made available and that the conventional manipulation strategies were designed to extract. He was doing something that the clinical framework had no category for, because it was not a clinical phenomenon, but a philosophical one. He was making an argument. He was making it across the specific duration of their therapeutic engagement, using the specific tools of his particular intelligence, the wit, the precision, the specific ability to identify the exact vulnerability in any argument presented against his position, and to press on that vulnerability with enough force to make the argument's holder feel the pressure, and he was making it. Not to a credulous audience, but to a trained professional, whose training should have equipped her to recognize and resist exactly this kind of intellectual engagement with a patient's ideation. The argument itself was not sophisticated in the sense of being difficult to understand. The Joker was not making a complex academic case that required specialized knowledge to follow. He was making a simple case, which was the most difficult kind to defend against, because simple cases are the hardest to dismiss without seeming to dismiss the evidence they rest on. The case was this: the categories that organized Harleen Quinzel's professional understanding of her work, sanity and madness, health and pathology, the appropriate and the inappropriate, the therapeutic and the harmful, were not descriptions of a real distinction in the world, but names applied to a social preference, labels that the majority attached to the configurations of mind and behavior it found comfortable and withheld from the configurations it found uncomfortable, with the withholding constituting neither a diagnosis nor a judgment of genuine moral significance, but simply the exercise of social power dressed in the language of medical authority. The Joker was not mad in this account. He was clear-sighted in a way that most people found intolerable, and the intolerance was called madness because calling it madness was more comfortable than acknowledging that the clarity was real. This argument was not new. Versions of it had been made in academic literature that Harleen Quinzel had read: the anti-psychiatry tradition, the sociological critiques of the diagnostic categories, the philosophical challenges to the concept of mental illness that had been circulating in her field's periphery for decades. She had encountered them as intellectual positions, had found them interesting, and in certain specific cases, compelling as critiques of particular diagnostic practices, and had nevertheless arrived at her clinical placement with the conviction that the categories she had been trained to apply were sufficiently grounded in genuine human suffering and genuine human difference to be worth applying. Carefully, she had the intellectual tools to engage with the argument. What she had not previously encountered was the argument made by the thing it was about, made by the specific example of the kind of mind the argument was claiming had been misclassified, present in the room across from her and demonstrating, by existing in the specific way it existed, the specific thing it was claiming. The Joker was not presenting the argument and then pointing to himself as an example. He was the argument. The specific quality of his intelligence, the specific character of his humor, the specific way he saw and described the world around him, and found in it the things that the argument predicted would be there: the absurdity, the arbitrariness, the thin membrane between the order that the institution represented and the chaos that the institution was designed to contain. All of this was not a rhetorical strategy deployed in support of a position, but the lived expression of a consciousness that had genuinely arrived at the position through the specific experience of being that consciousness in that world. He was not performing the argument. He was the argument, walking around in a hospital gown and speaking across a clinical desk to a woman whose professional training had been designed to help people who suffered from the gap between their inner experience and the world's demands, but who had not been designed to help or to withstand. Someone whose inner experience was genuinely coherent and whose relationship to the world's demands was not the suffering of someone who could not meet them, but the clarity of someone who had seen through them. The therapeutic sessions became, across their duration, a reversal of the intended relationship, not a sudden or dramatic reversal, but a gradual one, accomplished through the specific accumulation of individual moments in which the expected distribution of understanding and confusion was inverted. The therapist was supposed to understand things about the patient that the patient did not yet understand about himself, to see the patterns that the patient's own perspective prevented him from seeing, to offer the interpretive framework that could make the patient's experience more legible and therefore more manageable. What was happening instead was that the Joker was offering Harleen Quinzel an interpretive framework that was making her own experience more legible in ways that her professional training had not provided, was showing her things about the institution she worked within, about the categories she applied, about the specific relationship between the authority she exercised and the social functions that authority served, that she had not previously seen clearly and that, once seen, were difficult to unsee. The specific process by which Dr. Quinzel became Harley Quinn was the process of a worldview's replacement, not the destruction of one worldview and the installation of another in its place, which would have left an empty space between the two that the person crossing it would have experienced as a crisis, but the gradual substitution of one organizing framework for another, accomplished through the specific mechanism of making the new framework feel like a more accurate description of what the existing one had been attempting to describe. She did not feel, at each individual step of the process, that she was being changed. She felt that she was being clarified, that the specific confusions and the specific inadequacies of her previous understanding were being resolved rather than replaced, that the Joker was not dismantling her professional identity, but revealing the limitations of the specific version of it she had been practicing and pointing toward a more honest version. By the time the accumulation of clarifications had produced in her something that her former colleagues would have recognized as a complete transformation, she experienced it not as transformation, but as arrival, as having finally understood what she had always been working toward. The specific content of what she became was not a diminished version of what she had been, but a redirected version, and the redirection was the specific victory. Harley Quinn retained the psychiatric knowledge, the understanding of psychological vulnerability and psychological resilience, the specific training in what made people susceptible to influence, and how that susceptibility could be engaged. She retained the intelligence that had earned her doctoral credentials and the analytical capability that had attracted supervisors' attention. She retained the capacity for genuine emotional depth that had made her a potentially effective therapist, the specific quality of caring about the people in her professional orbit that the therapeutic relationship required. All of this remained, and all of it had been reoriented by the Joker's specific form of influence toward the purposes that his thesis required, rather than the purposes that her training had specified. She was a more dangerous person after the transformation than before it, in the most literal and most comprehensive sense, because the capabilities that had made her potentially very good at helping people were now organized around a different understanding of what helping meant and what people were. The Joker's specific victory in her case was therefore not the creation of an accomplice, though the accomplice was the immediate practical result, but the demonstration of a claim, the demonstration that the specific kind of training that produced the specific kind of professional that Harleen Quinzel had been was not an adequate protection against the specific kind of intelligence and the specific kind of philosophical pressure that he represented, and that the apparatus of mental health treatment could itself become the vehicle of the very dissolution of psychological stability it was designed to prevent, when the specific variables of therapist and patient were configured in the specific way that the Joker had arranged them. The training that was supposed to protect her had not failed because it was poorly designed. It had failed because it had been designed for a different kind of challenge than the one the Joker represented. And the specific gap between the challenge it was designed for and the challenge it encountered was exactly the gap that the Joker's particular intelligence had identified and exploited. The victory was not over her weakness. It was over the specific limitation of the framework that was supposed to constitute her strength. Her subsequent presence in the Arkham games in every phase of the story, before and after the Joker's death, as accomplice and as griever and as inheritor and as the specific ongoing expression of a transformation that the Joker achieved before the first game began, was the ongoing testimony to the completeness of this victory. The transformation had not been reversed by the Joker's death. It had not been complicated into something more ambivalent by the grief she experienced when she lost him, though the grief was real and the ambivalence it produced was real. The specific worldview that the Joker had installed in Harleen Quinzel's place persisted through every subsequent event of the Arkham timeline, because the installation had been thorough enough to constitute not an overlay on her previous self, but a replacement of the organizing framework through which that self had been maintained. The Joker had not simply changed her mind. He had given her a different mind to think with, made from the same raw material of her intelligence and her emotional depth and her specific capabilities, organized around principles that served his thesis, rather than the healing it had been trained to pursue. Section 4. The Asylum Gambit. How being captured was the win. There is a specific quality to the kind of victory that looks, from the outside, exactly like a defeat. And that quality is that it is very difficult to recognize until the full sequence of events has played out, and the relationship between the apparent defeat and the actual victory has become visible in retrospect. The Joker's surrender at the beginning of the Arkham Asylum events was, from the outside, from Batman's perspective, as he escorted the apparently subdued and apparently controlled prisoner through the facility's processing procedures, a clear tactical success, the containment of a known threat within a secured environment under institutional oversight, the specific outcome that the criminal justice system existed to produce, and that Batman's intervention had on this occasion helped to bring about without apparent complication. The fact that the apparent success was a deliberate setup, that the surrender had been choreographed by the person surrendering as the opening movement of a plan whose existence Batman was not yet aware of, that the processing procedures themselves had already been compromised by the preparation the Joker had made for this specific moment. All of this was invisible from the outside, invisible for precisely the reason that made the setup effective, which was that the assumption of good faith in the processing of a captured criminal was itself the specific assumption that the Joker had identified as the vulnerability he was going to exploit. The Joker had needed to be inside Arkham. He had not needed to be outside. It had not needed the freedom that escape attempts were organized around recovering. He had not been attempting to return to any operational status that his incarceration had interrupted. What he needed was the specific access that institutional custody provided to the specific resources that the Titan program required, and what institutional custody specifically provided was access without the security scrutiny that a voluntary entry would have attracted. A person who walks into a facility and asks for access to its pharmaceutical stores is questioned. A person who is processed as a prisoner and assigned to the existing custody arrangements, whose presence in the facility is managed by the standard procedures, whose specific parameters had been compromised before his arrival, who has allies already in place within the institutional infrastructure that was supposed to be managing him. This person had access without scrutiny, which was the specific access the operation required. The surrender was therefore not a defeat accepted in the service of a larger strategic position, not the sacrifice of a tactical advantage for a strategic one, which is the conventional military framework for understanding the deliberate acceptance of apparent loss. It was the first move of a plan in which the apparent loss was the precondition for everything that followed, in which the specific form of the defeat was chosen precisely because it provided the specific access that the plan required and that no other form of entry could have provided. Batman, escorting the Joker through the asylum's processing procedures, was Batman unwittingly delivering the Joker to exactly where the Joker needed to be, with the institutional legitimacy of the delivery ensuring that the specific security measures that might otherwise have detected the operation were not applied because the delivery itself had satisfied the conditions under which those measures were normally triggered. This specific quality of the setup, the use of Batman's own role in the criminal justice system as the mechanism of giving the Joker what he needed, was itself the first demonstration of the evening's central thesis. Before any other element of the Arkham Asylum events had been deployed, the system that was supposed to contain the Joker had been made, through the specific exploitation of its own procedures, into the mechanism of his access to the resources required for the system's undermining. The institution existed to take custody of dangerous individuals and to manage that custody through established procedures. The established procedures had been compromised. The result was that the institution's normal function, the processing of a dangerous individual through its custody procedures, was simultaneously the thing the institution was designed to do and the first stage of the plan that would destroy the institution's ability to continue doing it. The irony was not incidental but architectural, the specific design of a plan that understood the institution's vulnerability well enough to use the institution's strengths as the instrument of its own exposure. The subsequent takeover, the progressive expansion of the Joker's control from the processing area through the security systems to the general population of the facility, was the demonstration on its most relevant possible canvas of the specific thesis that the Arkham Asylum events had been constructed to demonstrate. The thesis was not simply that the asylum was insecure, though the demonstration of insecurity was part of its evidence. The thesis was about the specific character of institutional security, about the way that every security system depended on assumptions, about the intentions of the people operating within it, and about what happened when those assumptions were violated by someone with sufficient intelligence and sufficient preparation to identify and exploit the exact points where the assumptions did the most structural work. The asylum's security was designed around the assumption that its most dangerous patient was attempting to get out. Every protocol, every procedural safeguard, every contingency measure that the facility's designers had built into its operating architecture was organized around the specific threat model of a dangerous person attempting to escape, because escape was the conventional failure mode of custodial institutions, and the one against which conventional institutional design was developed. The Joker was not attempting to escape. He was attempting to remain inside, while transforming what inside meant, was attempting to convert the sealed environment from a controlled space into a space he controlled, not by leaving the boundary that the facility had established, but by taking possession of what the boundary enclosed. The security systems that were designed to prevent escape were not designed for this, had not been configured to detect or respond to this, were in certain cases actively useful to the Joker's purposes, because the same systems that prevented escape also prevented external intervention, creating the sealed environment that the takeover required in order to proceed without the external interference that an open environment would have permitted. The Titan program itself was the specific experimental design that the Arkham Asylum events had been constructed to test, and understanding what it was testing requires understanding what Batman represented as a threat to the Joker's thesis. Batman was, in the Joker's analytical framework, the most sophisticated single expression of the proposition that the Joker was wrong, the most capable, the most prepared, the most comprehensively equipped individual that the order-maintaining world had produced for the specific purpose of demonstrating that the Joker's thesis was not merely wrong, but addressable through sufficient application of physical capability and moral clarity. The Titan program was the Joker's specific attempt to engineer the circumstances under which this proposition could be tested at its absolute limits, to create a configuration of physical threat that would require Batman to operate at the precise edge of what he was capable of, and to observe what happened at that edge to the specific moral framework that organized his operation. The titangent enhanced subjects represented a specific category of threat that the Joker had calculated would push Batman further than any previous configuration of Gotham's criminal population had pushed him physically. Overwhelming in a way that required genuine tactical adaptation, rather than the confident application of superior preparation, distributed across the facility in ways that prevented the systematic management that Batman's operational framework was built around, and supplemented by the specific psychological pressure of the Joker's running commentary and the ongoing threat to the hostages whose welfare constrained Batman's tactical options throughout the engagement. The combination was designed to produce Batman at his absolute limits, which was the configuration the Joker needed in order to observe the specific things he was trying to observe. What Batman revealed at those limits was a comprehensive operational profile, a map of the specific decisions he made when every decision had significant consequences, the specific moral calculations he performed when competing obligations required prioritization, the specific emotional responses he had to the specific kinds of provocation that the Joker was uniquely equipped to deploy. The Joker watched Batman move through the transformed asylum and documented, through the specific architecture of the situations he had constructed, the exact parameters of Batman's operational envelope, where his capability was most complete and where it was most constrained, what kinds of threats produced the most effective, and what kinds produced the most burdened responses, which specific relationships and which specific obligations could be used as leverage in subsequent engagements, and which could not. The defeat of the titangent-enhanced Joker at the climax of the Arkham Asylum events was the defeat of the scheme's immediate objective, and simultaneously the completion of the scheme's deeper objective, which was the acquisition of this profile. Batman had demonstrated, through the specific performance of his response to everything the Arkham Asylum events had placed in his path, exactly what he had shown the Joker, through the forced transparency of operating at his limits, in the Joker's carefully designed experimental environment, the specific character of the moral and operational architecture that the subsequent experiments would be calibrated to address. The Joker who was defeated at the end of Arkham Asylum was a Joker who understood Batman more completely and more precisely than he had understood him at the beginning of the evening, and the understanding he had acquired was durable in a way that the tactical failure was not, was permanent information about a permanent subject, available for the design of every subsequent experiment, unaffected by the arrest that followed the scheme's tactical resolution. The specific landscape that the Joker had created on the island during the takeover, the transformed spaces of the facility, the exposed wreckage of an institution whose claim to be managing its most dangerous residents had been completely demolished by a single evening's demonstration, was the most comprehensive single expression of the demonstrative category of victory available in the Arkham Asylum events. The asylum was, for the duration of the takeover, the living evidence of the Joker's thesis about the fragility of institutional order was a concrete and undeniable showing, visible to Batman in every corridor and every repurposed room, of the specific configuration that the world approached when the specific work of maintaining its order was insufficient to the specific intelligence directed at its undermining, making Batman walk through this evidence, requiring him to navigate the transformed asylum in order to address the crisis, confronting him at every turn with the specific things that the evening had revealed about the institution he was trying to restore, was the most elegant single achievement of the Arkham Asylum events. It was not sufficient to demonstrate the thesis to a neutral observer. The demonstration had to be made to the most relevant possible audience, which was the person whose existence was organized around refuting it, and it had to be made in the environment that made the refutation most personally and most immediately relevant. A Batman walking through the ruins of the institution designed to contain the thing he fought most completely against, confronting at every step the evidence of what happened when that containment failed. Understanding in the most direct possible terms the specific relationship between the work he did and the specific harm that work was designed to prevent this. Batman was the audience for the most complete and most personally addressed version of the Joker's demonstration that any single operation could have produced, and the demonstration had been received, regardless of whether it was acknowledged, because the evidence was present and unavoidable and real. The Joker's laughter at the end of the first game was not the laughter of defeat. It was the laughter of someone who had set out to do several things and had done most of them, whose tactical failure was the least significant of the evening's outcomes, and whose understanding of what the evening had produced was more complete and more accurate than the understanding of the person who had defeated him. He had been captured. He had also collected the data he had come for, demonstrated the thesis he had arrived intending to demonstrate, corrupted the specific person he had spent months preparing to corrupt, and given the institution that would continue to house him a specific set of experiences that it would be organizing its responses to for the foreseeable future. The capture was the punctuation mark at the end of a sentence that the Joker had finished writing. It was not the end of the paragraph. Section 5, the blood in the veins, the Joker infection, and the conquest of Batman. Of all the victories available in the Joker's catalogue across the full span of the Arkham universe, the blood infection was the most intimate in the literal biological sense of being something that operated inside Batman's body rather than outside it, and intimate in the deeper sense of being something whose design reflected a knowledge of Batman so complete and so specific that the design itself was a form of possession. The inscription of the Joker's understanding of Batman's particular vulnerabilities into a biological weapon calibrated to exploit them with a precision that no external assault could have achieved. The Titan program had pushed Batman to his limits from the outside. The infection reached past the limits entirely, bypassed every defensive perimeter that the decades of preparation had established, and placed its specific mechanism of harm at the center of the biological system that those defenses were organized to protect. It was not an attack on Batman's armor, it was an attack on what the armor contained. The mechanism of the infection was a contaminated blood transfusion, the specific exploitation of a medical situation that had created the specific vulnerability of needing medical attention, and the specific exploitation of the trust that a medical context generates in the person receiving care within it. The Joker had understood that Batman's operational preparation, however comprehensive, required the specific biological substrate of the human body that sustained it, and that the human body required care in circumstances of injury or illness that created moments of genuine vulnerability, moments when the defenses that constant preparedness maintained were necessarily relaxed in the service of the monde. Biological requirements that the defenses were organized to protect. The contaminated transfusion was the specific instrument chosen for the specific moment of that vulnerability, introduced into Batman's bloodstream with the clinical precision of a medical procedure and the specific malice of someone who had been waiting for exactly this configuration of circumstances. The infection did several things simultaneously, and the simultaneity was itself part of the design, the specific engineering of a situation in which every consequence of the infection was also a consequence of the others, creating a self-reinforcing system of harm that would be difficult to address in parts because the parts were mutually dependent. Physically, the infection produced a progressive deterioration whose specific timeline created the urgency that organized the Arkham City events. The knowledge that the deterioration would eventually reach a point beyond recovery, creating the specific time pressure that forced Batman to engage with the Arkham City situation in a mode that his normal operational framework would not have required, accepting risks and making decisions that the absence of an existential deadline would have allowed him to defer. The time pressure was not incidental to the design but central to it, because Batman, under time pressure, was Batman making different decisions, more compressed, more willing to accept uncertainty, more exposed in the specific ways that the Joker's subsequent experimental designs were organized around exploiting. Neurologically, the infection produced hallucinations of the Joker images and voices that appeared during the moments of greatest operational pressure and that constituted a running commentary on what was happening, delivered by the specific voice that Batman least wanted running commentary from, in the specific moments when commentary was most disruptive to the concentration that the circumstances required. The neurological effects were not a random byproduct of the biological mechanism, but a specifically designed feature. The Joker had understood that the most disabling thing he could introduce into Batman's experience was a version of himself that could not be stopped, could not be contained, could not be managed by any of the operational strategies that the decades of preparation had developed for managing the Joker's specific form of threat, because this version existed inside the mind that those strategies operated from, rather than in the external world that those strategies were designed to address. A hallucinatory Joker was not simply a distraction. It was the specific impossible opponent, the one against whom Batman's complete toolkit was unavailing, because the toolkit had been developed for engagement with threats in the external world, and this threat existed in the internal one. Every other threat in the Arkham City events could be engaged through the standard framework of Batman's operational approach, assessed, planned against, engaged with the specific combination of physical capability and tactical intelligence that the preparation had produced. The hallucinatory Joker could not be assessed or planned against or engaged, could only be endured, which meant that Batman was required to navigate the most demanding external circumstances of his career in Arkham City while simultaneously managing an internal adversary against whom management was not available. The parallel dying that the Arkham City events organized the Joker, also deteriorating from the Titan formula's after effects, also facing a biological deadline that the available medical resources could not address, also requiring the specific cure that neither of them could access without the other's involvement, was not a symmetry that had emerged accidentally from the situation's logistics, but the specific design of the person who had arranged for the infection to occur in the first place. The Joker had engineered a situation in which he and Batman were, for the duration of the Arkham City events, biologically entangled, their survival conditions literally linked by the shared pathogen and the shared urgency of finding a cure that the pathogen's existence in both of them made necessary for both of them. The entanglement was the most complete physical expression available in the biological register of the claim the Joker had always been making about their relationship, which was that they were not simply opponents, but something more complicated and more disturbing, something whose existence required both of them, whose meaning was organized around the specific form of the interaction between them, rather than being located in either of them independently. Batman fighting through Arkham City with the Joker's infection in his bloodstream and the Joker's hallucination in his mind was not simply a Batman with an additional operational challenge. It was a Batman who was, for the first time in their relationship, carrying the Joker literally inside him, who was experiencing, in the most direct possible physical terms, what it meant to have the Joker's presence be genuinely inescapable. Every previous form of the Joker's engagement with Batman had been external, had been something Batman encountered in the world and moved through, and eventually returned from to the internal space of his own psychology, which the Joker had not yet reached. The infection reached that internal space directly, placed the Joker's biological presence and the Joker's hallucinatory voice inside the very place that Batman had always been able to return to as a refuge from external engagement, and made the refuge unavailable by making the Joker part of what it contained. The specific character of the hallucination's content was as deliberately designed as its existence. The hallucinatory Joker did not appear to make random observations or to deliver random threats. He appeared at the moments of greatest moral difficulty, and greatest emotional weight to comment on those moments with the specific precision of someone who had studied Batman's psychology closely enough to know exactly what kind of commentary would land most heavily and at exactly the moments when its landing would be most disruptive. The commentary was not simply taunting, though the taunt was present, it was analytical, organized around the Joker's specific reading of what Batman's behavior in each difficult moment revealed about the framework that organized that behavior. And the readings were not inaccurate in the way that a simple taunt could be dismissed as inaccurate. They were the readings of someone who understood Batman's moral framework well enough to identify, in real time, the specific tensions within it that the current circumstances were exposing, and to name those tensions with the clarity of an outside observer who was also, uniquely, an inside one. The specific consequence of this experience on Batman's decision-making during the Arkham City events was significant and real. Batman, under normal operational conditions, made decisions from a specific psychological position of clarity and commitment, the position of someone whose values and whose methods were thoroughly integrated, whose understanding of what he was doing and why he was doing it was sufficiently settled that the decisions the situation required could be made without the kind of ongoing internal negotiation that compromise and ambivalence produce. The infection disrupted this position at the most fundamental level, not by changing Batman's values or his methods, but by introducing into the space where those values and methods operated a running counter-argument delivered by the specific voice best qualified to make it an argument that every decision was wrong, or costly, or revealing of something that the decision-maker would prefer not to have revealed, delivered at the moment of the decision by the specific presence that the decision-maker was trying hardest to exclude from the decision-making process. The moment when Batman made the choice not to administer the cure to the dying Joker was the moment that the infection's design had been working toward, the moment when the specific configuration of circumstances that infection had created reached its intended culmination. The Joker was dying, the cure was present, the choice was available, and Batman, in full awareness of all three of these facts, made the decision to let the Joker die rather than to save him. The specific moral character of this decision occupied a territory that the rule's conventional formulation did not cleanly address, because the rule was organized around the prohibition of killing, and this was not technically a killing. There was not the application of force that ended a life, but the withholding of care that permitted a death already in progress to reach its conclusion. The distinction was real, and it was also, in the most honest possible accounting of what the decision meant, insufficient to separate what Batman had done from what the rule was designed to prevent him from doing, because the awareness that the cure existed and the conscious decision not to use it made the Joker's death an outcome of Batman's choice in a way that the rule's defenders could not simply dismiss as morally irrelevant. The Joker died knowing this. Died having extracted from the person most committed to the rule's maintenance the specific moral compromise that the rule was organized to prevent. Died with the knowledge of having been let die by the person who claimed that letting people die was not something his framework permitted. The specific satisfaction of this knowledge in the Joker's final moments was not the satisfaction of a plan successfully executed. The Titan program had not been successfully executed. The Arkham City scheme had not achieved the specific outcomes it had been organized around, but the satisfaction of a thesis confirmed, the confirmation that the moral framework he had always argued was a construction with a limit, had revealed that limit in the most specific and most personal and most undeniable possible terms, in the final moment of the relationship that the thesis had always been about. The hallucinatory Joker, who continued in Batman's psychology during the Arkham Knight events, was the infection's most lasting consequence, the specific form of the Joker's survival into a world that no longer contained him physically, the persistence of his presence in the one location that no arrest or death or biological defeat could reach, which was the mind of the person whose entire existence had been organized around engaging with the Joker's presence in the external world. The external Joker could be captured, could be contained, could be managed through the mechanisms that the decades of preparation had developed. The internal Joker had no mechanisms available against him except the mechanisms of psychological resistance and endurance, which were mechanisms that required a different kind of strength than the physical and tactical preparation had been organized to produce. The specific content of the hallucinatory Joker's interactions with Batman during the Arkham Knight events was the continuation of the argument that the infection had been making from the beginning. The argument that the moral framework was a construction, that the limit was real, that Batman was not the thing he claimed to be, but the thing the Joker had always known him to be, which was a person whose commitment to the rule was a commitment to a construction that the right pressure would eventually dissolve entirely. The hallucinatory Joker was making this argument from inside the mind of the person it was about, without the possibility of the argument being interrupted by a batarang or a takedown, or any of the other mechanisms that had managed the argument's external expression throughout their relationship. The argument was simply there, persistent and precise, and delivered with the specific authority of something that had managed to get inside and stay inside, waiting at every moment of pressure to resume from exactly where it had left off. What the infection achieved, taken in its full scope across the Arkham City and Arkham Knight events, was the specific form of conquest that the Joker's thesis had always been working toward, not the conquest of Batman's body, which the Titan program had attempted and failed to achieve, not the conquest of Batman's city, which various schemes had damaged without definitively accomplishing, but the conquest of Batman's psychology, the establishment within the specific internal space that had always been Batman's deepest refuge of a permanent presence organized around the argument that the refuge was not what Batman claimed it to be, and that its limits were exactly where the Joker had always said they were. It was the most intimate possible form of victory. It was also in the specific framework of what the Joker had been working toward across the entirety of his career, the most philosophically complete. Section 6. The Making of the Arkham Knight. Jason Todd and the Joker's masterwork of human destruction. There is a specific category of cruelty that operates not through the destruction of a person, but through the conversion of that person into something organized entirely around the harm of a specific target, the transformation of a human being whose particular formation, whose particular knowledge and particular emotional architecture and particular relationship to the intended target makes them uniquely effective as an instrument of that harm in ways that no externally constructed weapon could replicate. This category of cruelty requires a specific kind of intelligence to execute, because identifying the right person, understanding what that person is made of completely enough to know what they could be made into, and possessing both the access and the ruthlessness to perform the transformation systematically and without the hesitation that ordinary human moral constraint would impose, all of this requires exactly the combination of analytical precision and complete moral vacancy that the Joker uniquely possessed among the population of Gotham's criminal landscape. Other villains in the Arkham universe caused harm on larger scales in certain respects and over shorter periods of time. None of them achieved, through a single sustained act of deliberate human destruction, a creation as comprehensively dangerous to its intended target as the Arkham Knight. The Arkham Knight was the Joker's masterwork, and understanding why requires understanding both what it was made from and what it was made for. Jason Todd had come to Batman in the specific circumstances that the Gotham of the pre-Arkham period produced with a consistency that was itself a form of institutional indictment, the circumstances of a young person whose life had been organized by the specific combination of poverty and exposure to criminal culture that Gotham's particular ecology of inequality generated in the lives of its most vulnerable residents, circumstances that had produced in him a specific configuration of capability and anger and desperation that had intersected with Batman's operational landscape at exactly the moment when the intersection could produce something other than its usual outcome, which was the acceleration of the trajectory those circumstances had established rather than its interruption. Batman had seen in Jason Todd the specific quality that the Robin role required, and that was distinct from the simple qualities of physical capability or tactical intelligence which were more widely available and more straightforwardly trainable. He had seen the specific quality of commitment, the capacity for the particular form of absolute dedication to a purpose larger than personal survival that the work demanded, and that could not be trained into a person who did not already possess its foundation, which was the particular relationship to injustice that came from having experienced its specific weight from the inside, rather than having observed it from a protected position. The recruitment was morally complicated in ways that the Arkham universe documents without fully resolving, because the complication was real, and resisting the impulse to smooth it into something more comfortable than it was would be a disservice to the specific honesty that the subject deserves. A child recruited into the operational landscape of Gotham's most violent criminal conflicts was a child whose development was being organized around a set of demands that normal human development was not designed to accommodate, whose formation as a person was being conducted simultaneously with the formation of a combatant, with the specific tensions between those two projects being managed by a mentor whose own formation had not included the tools for navigating those tensions in another person, because his own navigation of them had been conducted in isolation without the benefit of anyone who understood the problem well enough to help. Batman had made Jason Todd into an extraordinary operative. He had done so at costs to Jason Todd's ordinary development that the extraordinary operation could not simply override by being extraordinary, because the ordinary development was the substrate on which everything extraordinary was built, and the substrate's specific character mattered for the specific character of what was built on it. What the Joker recognized in Jason Todd, and recognized with the specific precision of someone who had been studying Batman's psychology for long enough to understand its architecture in detail, including the specific points where the architecture was most load-bearing and therefore most vulnerable to targeted stress, was not a weakness in the conventional sense. It was a specific emotional exposure created by the nature of the relationship itself. Batman's one rule, his refusal to kill, was the most visible of the moral constraints that organized his operation, and it was the rule that the Joker had always identified as his primary target. But the rule was a position, a stated commitment that could be engaged with directly through the application of sufficient pressure in the right configuration. The relationship between Batman and his Robin was something more fundamental than a position. It was the specific evidence of everything the rule was protecting. The specific human relationship that gave the abstraction of the rule its concrete meaning. Jason Todd was not simply a tactical asset in Batman's operation. He was the person whose existence demonstrated that Batman's project was not simply a war on crime, but an attempt to protect specific human beings from specific harm, and the Joker had understood that the most devastating attack available on Batman's project was not an attack on its methods, but an attack on its meaning, conducted through the specific person who most completely embodied that meaning. The capture was not an accident, and it was not a failure of Batman's operational security in any simple sense. It was the outcome of a deliberate operation designed by someone who understood Batman's methods well enough to identify the specific configuration of circumstances that would create the specific gap in those methods through which a person sufficiently important to create could be taken. The Joker had been patient in the design of this operation in a way that his public operations rarely required him to be patient, because the specific outcome he was working toward required the specific person to be in the specific relationship for a sufficient duration that the emotional significance of the relationship had been fully established before it was attacked. Taking Jason Todd too early would have been taking a trainee, would have produced an outcome that was tactically significant, but not emotionally devastating in the specific way that the Joker needed it to be devastating. Taking him at the right moment produced the specific result of attacking the relationship at its full emotional weight, of inflicting the maximum possible harm on the specific person for whom the harm was intended to be maximally devastating. The months of captivity that followed the capture were not simply months of physical abuse. though the physical dimension of the experience was real, and its effects on Jason Todd's biology and his neurological processing of pain and fear were real and lasting. The physical dimension was, in the Joker's operational design, the least important dimension, the vehicle through which the more important work could be conducted rather than the work itself. The work itself was the systematic deconstruction of the specific psychological architecture that Jason Todd had built as Robin, the specific framework of values and identifications and emotional attachments that organized his understanding of who he was and what he was doing and why it mattered, and its replacement with a different architecture organized around the specific hatreds and the specific obsessions that the Joker's design required the Arkham Knight to possess. The deconstruction proceeded through several distinct phases, each targeting a different element of the existing architecture, and the sequencing was deliberate, each phase designed to undermine the specific elements that the subsequent phase would be building on the ruins of, creating a systematic progression from the identity that Robin had been toward the identity that the Joker needed to create. The first phase targeted Jason Todd's belief in Batman as a protector, the specific faith that someone who had committed themselves to operating in Batman's shadow had to maintain in order for the commitment to make sense. The belief that the person at the center of the operation they had signed on for was adequate to the specific responsibility that the operation assigned to him, which included the responsibility of protecting the people who had organized their lives around his operation, and therefore made themselves dependent on his protective capability. The Joker demonstrated, through the sustained fact of Jason Todd's captivity, that this belief was false. Not through argument, not through the presentation of a case for Batman's inadequacy that Jason Todd could engage with and reject, but through the simple, undeniable, physically present fact of the situation itself. Batman had not come. Batman knew, or could have known, or should have known, that something had happened and had not responded with the specific urgency that the specific situation required, and the specific explanation for this failure, whatever the explanation was insufficient to address the specific weight of the experience of being the person who was waiting and continuing to wait, and eventually understanding that the waiting was not going to resolve in the rescue that the commitment should have produced. The Joker did not need to make an argument that Batman had failed Jason Todd. He needed to create and sustain the conditions under which Jason Todd could not escape arriving at that conclusion himself through the specific mechanism of his own experience rather than through someone else's persuasion, because the conclusions arrived at through one's own experience are far more resistant to subsequent revision than the conclusions installed by someone else's argument. The second phase targeted Jason Todd's understanding of Batman's moral framework, the specific set of values that had given the work its meaning and that had provided Jason Todd with the interpretive framework through which his own actions within the operation could be understood as good rather than simply as violent. The Joker presented, through the specific combination of evidence and framing that months of captivity provided him the opportunity to curate, a version of Batman whose specific moral failures and specific personal limitations were arranged in the specific order and with the specific emphasis required to make them appear not as the ordinary human limitations of an extraordinary person, but as the defining characteristics of a project that was not what it claimed to be. Batman, who had failed to prevent what was happening to Jason Todd, was not an Batman who had been outmaneuvered by a more prepared opponent. He was a Batman whose specific priorities, whose specific understanding of what the operation required and what it permitted, had produced the specific outcome of Jason Todd's continued captivity as a consequence that was, in some meaningful sense, a reflection of choices Batman had made about what mattered and in what order. This argument was not entirely true, but it was not entirely false. and the specific quality of the not entirely false that it possessed was the quality that made it most dangerous to the specific person in whose psychology it was being installed. An argument that is entirely false can be rejected. An argument that contains genuine evidence for a genuine grievance, presented in the specific conditions of captivity and pain, by someone who understands exactly how to frame the evidence to maximize its impact, cannot be rejected through the simple mechanism of identifying it as false, because it is not false in the simple way that a simple argument can be false. It is distorted, organized around a genuine truth that has been framed and sequenced and contextualized in a way that produces a specific conclusion more extreme than the evidence genuinely supports, and the distortion is invisible from inside the experience of receiving it under the specific conditions that the captivity created, because the conditions themselves had already compromised the specific analytical distance that the recognition of distortion requires. The third phase was the construction of the replacement, the specific identity that the deconstruction had been creating space for, assembled from the specific capabilities and the specific hatreds and the specific obsessions that the Joker's design required the Arkham Knight to possess in order to function as the weapon the Joker was manufacturing. The Arkham Knight was not Jason Todd with a different costume and a different name. He was a new identity constructed from the ruins of Jason Todd's previous identity. Using the raw material of Jason Todd's intelligence and Jason Todd's physical capability and Jason Todd's specific intimate knowledge of Batman's methods and psychology and emotional architecture, organized around an entirely different set of purposes and an entirely different understanding of what those capabilities were for. The military training that supplemented the deconstruction, the specific operational expertise that transformed Jason Todd's Batman-trained capability into the Arkham Knight's military-grade command capability, was the practical architecture of the weapon's effectiveness, and it was provided with the specific understanding of what it would be used for. An Arkham Knight who was simply dangerous was not the weapon the design required. The design required an Arkham Knight who was dangerous specifically and uniquely to Batman, whose particular combination of capabilities and knowledge made him effective against the particular target in ways that no externally manufactured opponent could replicate, because the knowledge that made him most dangerous was knowledge acquired from inside the relationship that the weapon was designed to attack. Jason Todd knew how Batman thought, knew the specific heuristics that organized Batman's tactical decision-making, the specific emotional attachments that created predictable vulnerabilities in his operational behavior, the specific moral commitments that constrained his options in ways that a sufficiently intelligent opponent could exploit by constructing situations that placed those commitments in direct conflict with each other. He knew these things not from the outside observation of an opponent who had studied Batman over years of adversarial engagement, but from the inside experience of someone who had trained alongside him and operated under his direction and trusted him completely, had given him the specific access to one's own psychology that complete trust produces, had allowed him to know the specific person that the training was building in a way that operational observation from the outside could never quite replicate. The Arkham Knight's campaign against Batman was organized around this knowledge with a precision that made it qualitatively different from every other adversarial engagement in Batman's documented career. Other enemies had learned to exploit Batman's methods through observation. The Arkham Knight exploited Batman's psychology through direct knowledge, through the specific intimacy of having once been the person Batman was protecting, which meant understanding both what Batman would do to protect and what Batman would feel when confronted with the evidence of having failed to protect, and being able to construct operational situations that engaged both of these simultaneously in the configurations that produced the maximum possible disruption to Batman's operational effectiveness. The revelation of the Arkham Knight's identity, the specific moment when Batman understood that the enemy whose capabilities had been straining his resources throughout the Arkham Knight events was Jason Todd, was the part of the talk, culminating expression of everything the Joker had designed the Arkham Knight to produce in Batman's psychology. The knowledge did not simply add an emotional dimension to an operational challenge. It restructured the entire operational challenge around the emotional dimension, made the emotional dimension the most important fact about the situation, and placed Batman in the specific position of being unable to engage with the operational problem through the normal mechanisms of operational engagement, because the normal mechanisms required a psychological position of clarity and compartmentalization that the identity revelation had made unavailable. A Batman who knew that the Arkham Knight was Jason Todd was a Batman who was simultaneously fighting an enemy and confronting, through the enemy's existence, the most complete single expression of his own failures that his career had yet produced. Not the failure to prevent harm to a stranger, which was the ordinary weight of the ongoing project's inevitable insufficiency. The failure to prevent comprehensive, systematic, deliberate, months-long harm to the specific person most directly in his care. A failure whose specific character, the Arkham Knight's existence, embodied with a completeness that made the abstract weight of the failure concrete and unavoidable and present in every moment of the engagement with its consequences. The Joker, who had designed all of this from the position of someone who would not be alive to see its fullest expression, had nevertheless constructed an outcome that operated independently of his continued presence, a weapon that functioned through the specific mechanism of making Batman fight the evidence of his own failures with the same precision and the same resources he would have applied to fighting any external threat. Section 7. Public demonstrations, mass psychological warfare, and Gotham's transformation. The Joker's victories over individuals, the specific people he transformed or infected or destroyed in the specific ways that the preceding sections have accounted for, were victories whose full significance was not contained in their immediate effects on the specific individuals involved. They were also demonstrations, and the demonstrative function was as important to their character as the destructive one, because the Joker's thesis was not a private proposition addressed to a private audience, but a public claim about the nature of the world, addressed to everyone capable of receiving the evidence of its truth. Gotham was not simply the geography within which the Joker operated. It was the laboratory within which the experiments were conducted, and the canvas on which the results were displayed, and the changes that those experiments produced in the collective psychology of the city's population, in the specific way that Gotham's citizens understood their city, their institutions, their relationship to the specific dangers and the specific protections that organized the conditions of their daily life, were as significant as any individual transformation the Joker had engineered, because they were transformations at the collective level, changes to the shared psychological environment that everyone who occupied the city was required to navigate, regardless of whether they had been individually targeted. The first and most foundational of the public demonstrations was the Arkham Asylum takeover, and its demonstrative significance extended far beyond the immediate operational events that the first game documented into the long-term transformation of the symbolic meaning of the institution within Gotham's collective understanding of its own landscape. Arkham Asylum had occupied a specific position in Gotham's psychology before the events of the first game, a position that was complicated and in many respects already troubled, because the institution's historical failures were well enough documented to have informed the public's understanding of it as something less than the reliably effective containment facility that its official description specified. But even within the complicated position it occupied, the asylum had maintained a specific functional meaning in the city's collective imagination, which was the meaning of the place where the most dangerous people were kept, the specific location of the specific boundary between the social landscape that ordinary citizens occupied and the population whose behavior had placed them beyond the ordinary social compact. The asylum was the box. Whatever doubts existed about the box's reliability, the box existed and was functioning, and its existence provided a specific form of reassurance, whose value was not primarily rational but psychological. The reassurance of a known location for a known threat, which is among the most fundamental of the psychological needs that institutional containment serves. The events of the first game demolished this reassurance with a completeness that no subsequent restoration of the institution's physical or operational integrity could fully reverse, because what had been demolished was not the physical structure, but the specific belief that the structure was sufficient for its stated purpose. The asylum had been shown, across the duration of a single evening, to be transformable by its most dangerous patient from a place of containment into a war zone, to be not the sealed box that the reassurance required, but a permeable environment whose specific vulnerabilities had been comprehensively mapped by the specific intelligence they were designed to contain, whose security architecture had been found inadequate to the specific challenge of the specific person. It was most critical that the architecture address, after the Arkham Asylum events, every Gotham citizen who thought about the asylum at all, thought about it differently, not as the reliable container it had been presented as being, but as the demonstrated inadequate container whose most important failure had been conducted in full institutional view and had produced the specific crisis that the entire apparatus of Batman's intervention had been required to address. This specific change in the collective understanding of the institution was a victory that the restoration of physical order at the end of the first game did not undo, because the restoration of physical order addressed the immediate consequences of the demonstration without addressing the demonstration itself, without removing from the historical record the specific evidence that the demonstration had produced, which was the evidence of what happened when the asylum's specific vulnerabilities were engaged by the specific intelligence of the specific person it had been built to contain. The asylum after the Arkham Asylum events was an asylum that everyone knew had been completely overrun by its most dangerous patient, and the knowledge persisted regardless of how thoroughly the overrunning was subsequently addressed, because knowledge of what a thing has been shown capable of being is not erasable by the thing's subsequent restoration to its previous state. The political consequences of this transformation in the asylum's symbolic meaning were specific and traceable. The specific argument for Arkham City's necessity, the argument that Hugo Strange constructed and that Quincy Sharp endorsed, and that the political apparatus of Gotham's government allowed to be made without the scrutiny that its premises warranted, was an argument built on the demonstrated inadequacy of the existing containment infrastructure, and the most dramatic single piece of evidence for that demonstrated inadequacy was the Arkham Asylum events. The Joker had not designed the Arkham City project and was not its primary architect, but the Joker had, through the specific demonstration of the first game's events, created the specific political conditions that made the project viable, had produced the specific institutional crisis whose existence gave Strange's proposal the appearance of addressing a genuine and demonstrated problem, rather than manufacturing a crisis in service of a concealed agenda. The creation of Arkham City was, therefore, in a meaningful and specific sense, a consequence of the Joker's demonstrative victory at the asylum, a consequence that extended the scope of that victory far beyond the immediate events of a single evening into the specific political transformation of a city's relationship to its most dangerous citizens, producing a project whose own subsequent events generated new demonstrations of the specific thesis that the asylum takeover had first publicly articulated. Arkham City was, among other things, a demonstration that the governmental authority that had constructed it was as inadequate to the specific challenge of managing Gotham's criminal population as the asylum had been, that the specific combination of ambition, corruption, and institutional inadequacy that the project represented was itself evidence of the Joker's claim that the institutions of order were organized around their own perpetuation rather than around the genuine protection of the people they claim to serve. The Joker's infiltration of Arkham City's social dynamics, his establishment of operational presence within the walled environment, his manipulation of the factional conflicts that organized the city's internal political landscape, his use of the environment as the staging ground for the blood infection operation was not simply an operational achievement within the Arkham City context, but a second demonstrative victory whose scope was larger than the first. If the Arkham Asylum takeover had demonstrated that the most secure psychiatric facility in Gotham was insufficient to contain its most dangerous patient, the Arkham City infiltration demonstrated that the governmental project, specifically constructed in response to that demonstration, was equally insufficient, that the specific lessons the institutional response had claimed to have learned from the asylum events had not produced an institutional response adequate to the challenge that the asylum events had documented. Because the challenge was not primarily a physical security problem solvable through the construction of larger walls and more comprehensive surveillance, but a philosophical problem whose solution could not be achieved through architectural means. The mass psychological transformation that the Joker's public operations produced in Gotham's civilian population was not a single event but an accumulation, the specific aggregate of a decade of operations whose individual, demonstrative achievements, taken together, constituted a comprehensive reshaping of the psychological environment that the city's population was required to inhabit. Each individual demonstration had added a specific element to the specific understanding of what Gotham was and what living in it meant. The asylum takeover had added the specific knowledge that the contained were not reliably contained, and that the boundary between the ordinary social landscape and the population whose behavior had placed them beyond the ordinary social compact was more permeable than the institutional architecture claimed. The Arkham City events had added the specific knowledge that the governmental response to the permeability was organized around its own interests, rather than the interests of the population it claimed to protect. The ongoing operations that punctuated the periods between the major events had added, in their accumulation, the specific knowledge that the extraordinary measures required to manage the specific threats the Joker represented were not extraordinary in the sense of being rare and exceptional, but ordinary in the sense of being a permanent feature of the landscape, a permanent cost extracted from the city's collective psychological well-being by the specific presence of something that the specific apparatus of Batman's intervention could manage but not eliminate. The fear that organized this accumulation was not the simple fear of physical harm, the straightforward concern that the individual might be in the wrong place at the wrong time when one of the Joker's operations was in progress, and might thereby become a victim of the immediate violence. That fear was present, and it was real, but it was not the specific fear that the public demonstrations were designed to produce, and that they were most effective at producing, which was a more fundamental and more corrosive form of anxiety organized around uncertainty about the reliability of the world itself, around the specific awareness that the institutions and the conventions and the social arrangements that made it possible to organize one's daily life around assumptions of reasonable safety were demonstrably inadequate to the specific challenges that the Joker's existence created, and that the gap between what those institutions claimed to provide and what they demonstrably could provide was a permanent feature of the landscape rather than a correctable failure. This specific form of anxiety, the anxiety of living in a world whose protective structures have been publicly demonstrated to be insufficient to the specific threats that they were constructed to address, produces specific changes in collective psychology that are distinct from the changes produced by the ordinary risks of ordinary life in an ordinary city. Ordinary risk is navigable through ordinary prudence, through the specific behavioral adjustments that individuals make in response to the specific risks that ordinary life presents. Adjustments whose effectiveness is adequate to the risks they address, and whose adequacy provides a form of psychological stability. The anxiety of demonstrated institutional inadequacy is not navigable through ordinary prudence, because it is organized around the specific knowledge that the risks are not addressable through ordinary individual adjustment, that they require extraordinary institutional response, and that the extraordinary institutional response has been shown repeatedly and specifically to be less than fully adequate to the challenge it was constructed to address. The media's role in the amplification of the Joker's demonstrative victories was something the Joker understood with the specific sophistication of someone who had thought carefully about the relationship between the direct effects of his operations and the media-mediated effects between the harm done to the specific people in the immediate vicinity of any given scheme and the transformation of the collective psychology of the entire city that media coverage of the scheme produced in the much larger population that experienced the scheme through coverage rather than through direct contact. The Joker's operations were, in their specific design, always partly media events constructed with an awareness of how they would be covered, organized around the specific elements that media coverage was most likely to emphasize, and that the emphasized coverage was most likely to produce the specific psychological effects that the operations were designed to achieve in the population that experienced them through the media's lens. The specific things that coverage emphasized were the specific things that most effectively communicated the demonstrative content of the operations to the audience. That coverage reached the scale of the institutional failure. The operation had required the institution to acknowledge the specific inadequacy of the conventional response to the specific challenge the operation had presented. The specific distance between the official narrative of managed safety and the demonstrated reality of the specific vulnerability that the operation had exposed. Each coverage cycle added to the cumulative record of demonstration, built the specific body of public evidence for the Joker's thesis about the fragility of the institutions that claimed to manage the specific threats he represented, and did so for an audience orders of magnitude larger than any specific operation could have directly reached. The journalists and commentators who attempted to analyze the Joker's operations with the specific analytical frameworks that their professional training provided, the criminological frameworks, the psychological frameworks, the political science frameworks for understanding the relationship between individual criminal activity and institutional response, found themselves, repeatedly, in the position of describing the specific evidence for the Joker's thesis in the language of the frameworks that the thesis was about. The analysis of how the asylum had failed was conducted within the framework of institutional security analysis, which presupposed that the problem was a security problem, addressable through security improvements, which was exactly the presupposition that the Joker's demonstration had shown to be inadequate to the specific challenge his intelligence represented. The analysis of how Arkham City had failed was conducted within the framework of criminal justice reform, which presupposed that the problem was a policy problem, addressable through policy improvements, which was exactly the presupposition that the Arkham City events had demonstrated to be insufficient to the specific challenge that the combination of the Joker's intelligence and Hugo Strange's authoritarian ambition represented. The frameworks were inadequate to the specific challenge of describing what was actually happening, and their inadequacy in the specific task of describing it was itself a form of confirmation of the thesis that the events they were attempting to describe had been constructed to demonstrate. Section 8. The One Rule. Every time Batman almost broke it. The One Rule was not simply a rule in the sense of a behavioral constraint that Batman had chosen to observe and could choose to abandon when the specific costs of observing it became sufficiently high. It was the specific moral commitment around which Batman's entire psychological architecture had been organized since the specific night in Crime Alley, when the alternative, the world in which people with the capability to end other people's lives exercised that capability on the basis of their own judgment about who deserved to continue existing, had revealed its specific horror in the most personal possible terms. The rule was not a conclusion arrived at through philosophical reasoning about the relative merits of lethal and non-lethal approaches to crime control, though the philosophical reasoning that could support it was available and had been engaged. It was a response to a specific wound, the specific transformation of a specific child's world, by the specific act of a specific person, with a gun making a specific decision about who deserved to continue existing. A transformation so comprehensive and so permanent that everything built in the 40 years since had been organized, consciously or not, around the specific project of being something other than what that decision had represented. The Joker understood this. Understood it with the specific precision of someone who had studied Batman's psychology closely enough to trace the specific connections between the behavioral commitment and the wound it expressed, and who had recognized in those connections the specific architecture of a vulnerability that no physical attack could reach, but that the right configuration of moral pressure could engage directly. The rule was the most load-bearing element of Batman's psychological structure, the specific constraint whose maintenance organized everything else in the structure, whose violation would constitute not simply a behavioral change, but a restructuring of the foundation on which everything else was built. An attack on the rule was therefore not simply an attack on a specific behavioral tendency, but an attack on the specific thing that distinguished Batman's relationship to violence from the relationship of every other person in Gotham, who used violence in the service of their own understanding of justice. If the rule broke, the distinction broke with it, and the specific thing that the distinction was protecting, the specific psychological position of someone who used force in the service of something beyond personal judgment about who deserved to live, became unavailable. The systematic campaign to break the rule was not a single operation, but a sustained project organized across the entirety of the Joker's career in the Arkham universe, a project whose individual operations each contributed a specific refinement to the experimental design, each adding to the Joker's understanding of where the rule's limits were and what configuration of circumstances would most efficiently engage those limits in the ways that produced the specific outcome the project was working toward. The project was not organized around the expectation of immediate success. The Joker was not expecting Batman to kill him in any given encounter, was not calibrating each individual operation around the hope that this particular configuration of pressure would be the configuration that finally dissolved the constraint. The project was organized around learning, around the progressive accumulation of data about the rule's specific character, its specific limits, the specific circumstances under which it became most costly to maintain, the specific emotional and tactical pressures that moved Batman closest to the position from which the violation would be most likely to occur. The Arkham Asylum events contributed to this project in the specific way that a first experiment contributes to a research program by establishing baseline data, by demonstrating the rule's character under conditions of significant but not maximal pressure, by showing the Joker what Batman's commitment to the rule looked like when tested at the level of operational challenge that the Asylum events represented. Batman, at the end of Arkham Asylum, standing over the defeated T-tangent-enhanced Joker with the specific awareness of what the choice not to use lethal force in that moment would mean for the future, the specific understanding that the Joker would recover and return, and that the recovery and return would produce specific harms that the choice not to end the threat permanently would have permitted, was Batman demonstrating, through the specific character of that choice, the specific parameters of the rule's maintenance under conditions of significant pressure. The rule held. It held because the pressure, while significant, was not calibrated to the specific configuration of costs and consequences that the Joker's experimental design was working toward. The Arkham Asylum events had been designed to test many things, of which the rule's maintenance was one, and the specific pressure applied to the rule had been the pressure of a general demonstration of the rule's costs, rather than a precisely targeted assault on the specific threshold at which the costs would exceed the commitment's capacity to absorb them. The baseline data had been collected. The rule held at this level of pressure, with these specific costs visible and these specific consequences explicit, and the holding defined the lower boundary of the territory that subsequent experiments needed to surpass. The Arkham City events constituted a significant escalation in the precision and the specific design of the assault on the rule, and they produced the outcome that the Arkham Asylum events had established as the target, not the rule's dramatic violation, which would have been satisfying in a simple way, but was not the specific outcome the experimental design was working toward, but the rule's limit, the specific boundary at which the commitment's maintenance produced a moral compromise as significant as any the rule was designed to prevent. The specific moment when Batman possessed the cure and the Joker was dying, and the decision not to administer it was made, was not a moment of dramatic rule violation. It was something more disturbing and more philosophically significant. It was the moment at which Batman, while technically observing the rule's letter, violated its spirit through the specific mechanism of a deliberate omission that produced the same consequence as the act the rule prohibited. The specific moral philosophy engaged by this moment has been contested by people who prefer to understand the choice as a simple refusal to help an enemy as the straightforward expression of a limited duty of care towards someone whose own choices had created the circumstances of their death. This understanding is available. It is also, in the most honest possible engagement with what actually happened in that specific moment, insufficient to account for the specific moral weight of the decision. Batman did not simply fail to help someone who was dying. He possessed the specific means of preventing that death, was aware that he possessed those means, understood the consequences of not using them, and chose not to use them. The awareness and the choice are what distinguish the moment from a simple failure to render aid, to distinguish it in exactly the way that the rule's defenders would want to use, to distinguish Batman's choices from the dark choices of the people the rule was designed to distinguish him from, which is to say that the awareness and the intentionality of the decision place it in the same moral category as the acts the rule was organized to prevent, whatever its technical distinction from those acts in the matter of physical contact. The Joker died with this knowledge, died understanding, with the specific clarity of a person who had designed the situation with the specific outcome in mind, that the thing he had been working toward across the entirety of their relationship had been achieved not completely, not in the dramatic form that the explicit violation of the rule would have represented, but in the specific form that the experimental design had been refined toward over the years of progressive understanding of where the rule's actual limits were and what circumstances would engage those limits most precisely. The rule had been shown to have a limit. The limit had been reached. The specific moral architecture that the limit was supposed to protect had been shown in the most specific and most personally relevant possible circumstances to be a construction that sufficient pressure could bring to the specific point at which it became something other than what it claimed to be. The rule's relationship to the Jason Todd situation, the specific moral weight that the Joker's creation of the Arkham Knight placed on Batman's commitment, constituted a different form of the same assault, operating not through the direct confrontation that the Arkham City cure situation had staged, but through the specific mechanism of making the rule's maintenance, the specific mechanism of harm that the rule was supposed to prevent. Batman's refusal to kill had not protected Jason Todd, had not prevented the specific months of systematic human destruction that the Joker had conducted, had not shortened the duration of the captivity or diminished the comprehensiveness of the damage, had in a specific and traceable way contributed to the conditions under which the damage had been possible by creating, through the specific constraints that the rule imposed on Batman's operational methods, a set of behavioral parameters that the Joker had been able to incorporate into his planning with the confidence of someone working with known constants. The Joker's operational planning assumed that Batman would not kill. This assumption was not a vulnerability in the Joker's plan, but a structural feature of it, a known constant that the plan incorporated rather than a risk that the plan needed to account for. The specific operations that the Joker designed were designed for a world in which Batman would not kill, and in that world, they were designed to function effectively, despite whatever other responses Batman might produce. The rule that was supposed to be Batman's moral commitment had become, through the Joker's specific understanding of it, a predictive tool, a mechanism for anticipating Batman's behavior with sufficient confidence to build operational plans around the anticipation, plans whose specific effectiveness depended on Batman's commitment to the rule, being reliable enough to function as a constant in the operational calculus, rather than a variable that the plan needed to hedge against. The hallucinatory Joker's continued engagement with the rule during the Arkham Knight events was the specific form that the rule assault took after the Joker's death removed the possibility of direct confrontation. Internalized version of the same campaign that the external Joker had been conducting, now operating from inside Batman's psychology rather than from the outside operational landscape, and operating with the specific advantages that an internal position provided. The external Joker had been required to construct elaborate operational situations to place Batman in the configurations of moral pressure that engaged the rule's limits most directly. The internal Joker had no such logistical requirement, had direct access to the psychological territory where the rule was maintained, could apply pressure to the rule's foundations continuously, rather than in the specific moments when an operational situation created the opportunity, and could do so without the interruption that Batman's operational responses to the external Joker had always eventually managed to produce. The specific argument that the internal Joker made about the rule was not a new argument. It was the same argument the external Joker had always made, presented now from a position of irreducible presence, rather than from the position of an external voice that could be dismissed through the mechanism of ending the encounter. The rule was arbitrary. The commitment was a construction. The specific threshold that distinguished Batman's relationship to lethal force from the relationships of the people the rule was designed to distinguish him from was a threshold whose location had been shown to be less fixed than the commitment claimed, less protected by the moral architecture that claimed to support it, and more vulnerable to the specific configurations of pressure that the experimental design had spent a career developing the specific knowledge to construct. The argument had not changed. What had changed was that there was no longer any external location from which to make it. It was being made from inside the specific psychological space that the rule occupied, without the possibility of the space being secured against it, because the securing of that space had always been achieved through the mechanisms available for managing external threats, and those mechanisms were simply not available for managing a threat that existed inside the space itself. The eventual resolution of the internal Joker's campaign, Batman's specific confrontation with, and resistance to, the hallucinatory Joker's attempt to subsume his identity during the Arkham Knight events was not a simple victory for the rule. It was a demonstration that the rule could survive the specific assault the Joker had designed for it, which was not the same as a demonstration that the assault had been without effect. The rule survived. It survived in a psychology that had been changed by what it had survived, a psychology that now contained the specific knowledge of what maintaining the rule had cost, the specific awareness of the limits that the experimental design had located and documented, and the specific experience of having been required to maintain the commitment against the most sophisticated and the most comprehensively informed assault that the specific intelligence of the Joker's career had been building toward. Across the entirety of their shared history, the survival was genuine and the survival mattered, but the rule that survived was a rule that had been tested to its limits and had been found in the most honest possible accounting of what the testing had revealed. to have limits, to be a commitment maintained by will against specific costs, rather than a foundation supported by the structure of the world, which was precisely and exactly what the Joker had always claimed it to be, and precisely and exactly what the full body of evidence across the Arkham timeline had demonstrated, with specificity sufficient to constitute something that the simple word victory, for all its inadequacy to the full scope of what the evidence showed, remained the most accurate single word available to describe. Section 9. The corruption of institutions. How the Joker changed Arkham forever. The Joker's relationship to institutions was not the relationship of someone who hated them in the straightforward sense of finding them personally threatening or philosophically objectionable in a way that motivated their destruction as an end in itself. It was a more precise and more philosophically interesting relationship than that the relationship of someone who understood institutions as the most legible and most publicly available expressions of exactly the claim, his thesis, was organized around refuting, which was the claim that the order of the world was genuine rather than constructed, that the specific arrangements of authority and procedure and collective agreement that organized the behavior of large numbers of people were expressions of something real rather than elaborate and fragile performances of a reality that did not exist beneath the performance. Institutions were, in this understanding, the most ambitious and the most visible single expression of the delusion he was dedicated to exposing. They were not simply organizations through which his opponents operated. They were the specific form that the delusion took when it organized itself at scale, when the individual's private belief that the world had order became a collective project of maintaining that order through the specific mechanisms of institutional authority, and when the maintenance of those mechanisms was presented as evidence of the order's reality, rather than as the specific effort required to sustain a performance that would collapse without the effort. Attacking institutions was therefore not simply tactically useful in the way that attacking an opponent's organizational infrastructure is tactically useful in conventional conflict. It was philosophically central, was the specific form of demonstration most available and most legible to the broadest possible audience. Because the failure of an institution to perform the specific function that its existence claimed it was performing was visible to everyone who had been organized around the expectation of that performance, in a way that the failure of an institution to perform the specific function, individual, was not. The Joker's corruption of Arkham Asylum as an institution was not simply the corruption of a facility that happened to be his place of confinement. It was the corruption of the most specific and most relevant single institutional expression of the claim that the people whose behavior placed them outside the ordinary social compact could be managed, contained, and potentially returned to a condition compatible with the ordinary social compact through the application of the specific institutional mechanisms that the asylum represented. The asylum's claim was the therapeutic claim, the claim that the specific combination of confinement and treatment and structured environment could address the specific conditions that had produced the specific people it housed, could in some cases reverse those conditions, and in all cases manage them sufficiently to prevent the harm that unmanaged versions of those conditions generated in the broader social landscape. This claim was precisely what the Joker's presence in the asylum was most completely and most specifically designed to demolish. And the demolition was conducted not through a single dramatic act, but through the sustained accumulation of specific institutional corruptions, each individually small enough to seem like an ordinary consequence of the specific challenges the asylum faced in managing its most difficult population, but collectively constituting a comprehensive transformation of the institution from the inside out that left it, across the years of the Joker's occupancy and the events that his planning produced, fundamentally different from what it had been before he arrived. The corruption of the asylum's therapeutic mission had begun before the events of the first game and would have been traceable by someone with access to the full institutional record to the specific moment when the specific challenge of managing the Joker's particular form of intelligence within the therapeutic framework had begun to reshape the framework itself in ways that served the management challenge rather than the therapeutic mission. Every institution that attempts to manage something it cannot fully understand eventually develops practices organized around the management challenge rather than the institution's stated purpose. Because the stated purpose was designed for a population the institution understood, and the management challenge is presented by a population it does not. The asylum's practices around the Joker were practices that had developed in response to the specific challenge of containing someone who could use the therapeutic relationship as the instrument of his influence over the people. Responsible for his containment, someone whose specific intelligence made the ordinary protocols of clinical engagement available as tools of manipulation rather than as structures of therapeutic support. The specific ways the institution had adapted to this challenge were the specific ways that an institution adapts to any challenge that its original design was not equipped to address by developing workarounds, by modifying the official procedures to incorporate informal practices that the official documentation did not reflect, by gradually normalizing the gap between what the institution claimed to be doing and what it was actually doing in the specific case that the gap had been created to manage. Each individual adaptation was defensible in its own terms, was a reasonable response to the specific difficulty that it was designed to address. But the accumulation of adaptations across the years of the Joker's institutionalization had produced an institutional culture that was, in certain of its most important dimensions, organized around the specific requirements of managing the Joker's presence, rather than around the therapeutic mission that the institution's existence was supposed to serve. The staff, who had been most extensively exposed to the Joker's specific form of influence, were the staff whose professional formation had been most thoroughly modified by the experience, whose understanding of their roles, whose specific practices, whose ways of engaging with the institutional environment they inhabited had all been shaped by the specific demands of the management challenge in ways that the original therapeutic formation had not anticipated, and that the institution's supervisory structures had not been designed to detect or correct. The corruption was not experienced as corruption by the people undergoing it, because it was experienced as learning, as the development of the specific, practical wisdom that extended professional experience in a difficult environment produced. The specific kind of knowledge that could not be acquired from textbooks or training programs, but only from the direct encounter with the specific challenges that the specific environment presented. This specific quality of institutional corruption, its invisibility from inside the institution, its experience by the people undergoing it as professional development rather than professional degradation, was the quality that made it most durable and most resistant to the external interventions that might otherwise have addressed it. An institution whose corruption was visible to its members was an institution that could be reformed through the specific mechanisms of institutional accountability, through the identification of specific problematic practices, the correction of those practices through supervisory intervention, the replacement of staff whose conduct had fallen below the institutional standard, with staff whose conduct was more consistent with the institution's stated mission. An institution whose corruption was invisible to its members, experienced by them as appropriate professional adaptation to unusual professional challenges, was an institution that could not be reformed through those mechanisms, because the mechanisms presupposed an ability to distinguish between the institution's standard and its practice that the corruption had specifically undermined. The asylum's relationship to the Joker had, across the years of his institutionalization, produced exactly this quality of corruption, had generated an institutional culture whose specific character reflected the specific challenge of managing the Joker's presence in ways that the institution's official self-description did not acknowledge, and that the supervisory structures responsible for maintaining the gap between the official description and the operational reality were not equipped to close. The institution had been changed by the Joker before the events of the first game began. The events of the first game accelerated and made visible the changes that had already occurred, and added to them the specific additional changes produced by the comprehensive exposure of the institution's specific vulnerabilities in the most publicly available and most operationally definitive possible terms. The asylum that existed after the first game's events was not simply a damaged version of the asylum that had existed before them. It was a different institution, one whose self-understanding, whose relationship to its own official mission, and whose practices around the management of its most dangerous population had all been fundamentally altered by the specific experience of having its most dangerous patient convert the institution from a place of his confinement into the staging ground for the most comprehensive single assault on Gotham's security that any individual had yet mounted. The specific adaptations that the post-first game asylum developed in response to this experience were adaptations organized around the prevention of the specific events that had occurred around the specific vulnerabilities that the Joker's plan had exploited and the specific failures of the security architecture that the plan's execution had revealed. They were not adaptations organized around the therapeutic mission that the institution's official existence continued to claim as its purpose. Because the experience of the first game's events had produced in the institution's operational culture a permanent revision of the implicit priority, ordering a revision in which the prevention of another institutional takeover had moved to the top of the priority stack, and the therapeutic mission had moved to whatever position the specific demands of the security priority permitted. The asylum was now, in its deepest operational culture, a security facility that maintained a therapeutic facade rather than a therapeutic institution with security requirements. The Joker had inverted its essential character, had taken the specific institution most completely organized around the claim that dangerous people could be managed through therapeutic means, and transformed it into the specific institution most completely organized around the claim that dangerous people needed to be contained through security means. While the official description continued to insist that nothing fundamental had changed and that the therapeutic mission remained primary, the gap between the official description and the operational reality was the specific form that the Joker's victory over the institution took at the deepest level, not the physical events of the takeover, which had been addressed and resolved, but the permanent inversion of the institution's essential character that the takeover had produced, an inversion that the restoration of the physical order had done nothing to reverse, because the inversion was cultural and psychological rather than physical. The relationship between the Joker's institutional corruption and the creation of Arkham City deserves specific attention because it illustrates the specific mechanism through which victories at the institutional level propagated their effects into the broader political landscape in ways that extended their scope far beyond the immediate institutional context. Arkham City was made possible by a specific political argument, and that political argument rested on a specific body of evidence. And the most dramatic and most publicly legible single piece of evidence in that body was the Arkham Asylum events. The argument required the demonstrated inadequacy of the existing containment infrastructure, required it not as a hypothesis to be accepted on the basis of theoretical reasoning, but as a demonstrated fact that the public record confirmed, because the political support for the specific overreach that Arkham City represented required the specific fear that only demonstrated institutional failure could produce at the necessary scale. The Joker had provided the demonstration. The demonstration had provided the political conditions. The political conditions had produced Arkham City. Arkham City was, among its many other things, the most complete single expression of the specific political consequence of the Joker's institutional victories, the specific form that institutional crisis took when it propagated from the level of a single institution into the level of a city's political structure, producing not simply a reformed institution, but a new institutional arrangement whose specific character reflected the specific lessons that the political process had drawn from the institutional failures and whose specific inadequacies reflected the specific limitations of those lessons. The lessons had been drawn from the surface of the Joker's demonstrations rather than from their substance, had identified the physical vulnerabilities of the existing containment infrastructure as the problem to be addressed, and had proposed a larger and more physically comprehensive containment infrastructure as the solution, without engaging with the specific claim that the demonstrations had been making, which was that the problem was not physical but philosophical, and that no physical solution would be adequate to a challenge whose character was not primarily physical. Arkham City failed for precisely the reasons that the Joker's demonstrations had identified. Failed, not because its walls were too thin or its surveillance insufficient, but because its conception of the challenge was inadequate to the challenge's actual character, because it had been designed by people who had learned the wrong lessons from the specific failures that the Joker's career had produced, and who had, therefore, invested enormous institutional and political resources in a solution to a problem that was not the problem they were actually facing. The Joker's corruption of the institutional landscape was therefore not simply the corruption of specific institutions, but the corruption of the political process's ability to respond appropriately to those corruptions, the installation, through the specific character of the demonstrations he had staged, of a systematic misunderstanding of the challenge that produced systematically inadequate responses at every level of the institutional hierarchy that was attempting to address it. Section 10. Death as Victory. How the Joker won by dying. The specific horror of the Joker's death, the specific quality that distinguished it from the deaths of other antagonists whose ends had been straightforward conclusions to the specific threats they represented, was that it was not a conclusion, it was a transformation. The biological fact of the Joker's death at the end of Arkham City was the termination of his specific physical presence in the world of the Arkham universe, the ending of the particular biological process whose continuation had been responsible for the specific operations and the specific harms and the specific demonstrations that the preceding sections have accounted for. But the biological fact was the least significant thing about the death, in the same way that the biological fact of any individual event in the Joker's career was the least significant thing about it, was the substrate on which the philosophically significant thing occurred, the vehicle through which the philosophically significant thing expressed itself, the specific physical form taken by something whose most important dimensions were not physical but philosophical and psychological, and therefore not terminable by any merely physical intervention. The Joker had understood his own death with the specific clarity of someone who had spent his entire career thinking about what events meant, rather than what they were, who had developed through the sustained practice of converting physical situations into philosophical demonstrations, the specific cognitive habit of asking, about any event, including the event of his own dying, what the event was evidence of, and what it would continue to communicate after the physical process it described had been completed. His death was not simply something that happened to him. It was something he had been thinking about in terms of what it would mean and what it would demonstrate and what it would leave behind, and the specific quality of what it left behind reflected the specific sophistication of the thinking that had preceded it. The most immediate and most legible thing that the death left behind was the confirmation of the specific moral compromise that the Arkham City events had extracted from Batman, the specific demonstration, now permanently part of the historical record, that the rule had been shown to have a limit, and that the limit had been reached in the specific circumstances of the Joker's dying. The death itself was the permanent evidence of this demonstration. While the Joker was alive, the demonstration was a process, was the ongoing fact of a specific choice having been made in specific circumstances. A choice whose significance was present, but whose final weight would not be fully legible until the consequence of the choice had been fully expressed. The death completed the expression. made the choice's consequence concrete and irreversible, and available as a permanent piece of the historical record that would organize the understanding of the relationship between Batman and the Joker for everyone who subsequently had occasion to think about what that relationship had been and what it had produced. The Joker dying with what could be understood as a smile, with the specific quality of an ending that was organized around awareness of what had been accomplished, rather than around the ordinary human responses of fear or regret, or the desire for continuation was the specific physical expression of the understanding that the dying was a victory rather than a defeat, and that the victory was of the specific kind that the entire career had been working toward. Not the victory of a scheme successfully executed, because the scheme had failed in its tactical dimensions, and the failure was real. The victory of a thesis confirmed, of the most important argument having been demonstrated with the most specific and most personal and most undeniable evidence available. In the final moment of the relationship that the thesis had always been about, and through the specific mechanism of that relationship's ending, rather than despite it, the death accomplished, simultaneously, and through a single biological event, several things that no operational success had been able to accomplish, things whose specific character reflected the specific advantages of death as a form of communication over life, as a form of communication, in the particular context of the argument the Joker had been making and the particular relationship within which he had been making it. It transformed him from a physical threat that could be managed through the mechanisms of institutional containment into a psychological and philosophical presence that could not be managed through any available mechanism, because the mechanisms of institutional containment presupposed a physical existence to contain, and the Joker's death had removed the specific feature of his existence that those mechanisms were designed to address while leaving intact, and in certain respects amplifying the features of his existence that the mechanisms had never been adequate to address in the first place. The hallucinatory Joker who emerged in Batman's psychology following the death was not simply a symptom of the biological infection's neurological legacy, though it was that as well. It was the specific form that the Joker's philosophical presence took when the biological substrate through which that presence had previously expressed itself was no longer available, the specifically internalized version of the argument that had previously been made from the outside, now operating from a position that the mechanisms available for managing external arguments could not reach. The external Joker had been manageable in the specific, limited sense that the mechanisms of physical containment could prevent his immediate operational activity even when they could not address the underlying challenge his intelligence represented. The internal Joker had no such mechanism available against him, was immune to physical containment because he existed in a space where physical containment had no application, and was immune to the other mechanisms Batman might have deployed, because those mechanisms had all been developed for engagement with threats in the external world, and this threat was in the internal one. The specific content of the hallucinatory Joker's existence in Batman's psychology was not a random residue of a biological process, but a specific continuation of the philosophical project that the biological Joker had been pursuing, the same argument, addressed to the same audience, from a position of unprecedented intimacy and unprecedented persistence, that the biological version had never been able to achieve, because the biological version had always been separable from Batman by the mechanisms of physical containment, even when those mechanisms could not address the underlying challenge. The hallucinatory version was not separable, could not be placed in a cell or transported to a facility or managed through any of the procedural mechanisms that the institutional response to the Joker's external presence had been organized around. It was simply there, in the space where Batman's own thinking occurred, available at every moment of pressure and every moment of moral difficulty to resume from exactly the position where any previous interruption had left it. The Joker's death also activated the specific legacy operations that had been prepared to extend the project beyond the death itself. The specific arrangements that ensured that the biological termination of the Joker's individual existence would not terminate the broader project that his existence had been organized around. Harley Quinn's continuation of the Joker's operational legacy, the specific campaigns she organized in the periods following the death, the recruitment and the symbolism and the specific orientation of those campaigns toward the continuation of something that the Joker's death had not concluded, was the expression of the specific victory achieved through her transformation, now operating in the specific mode that the death had made available, which was the mode of a legacy rather than an ongoing operation. A legacy operates through a different mechanism than an ongoing operation, is organized around the communication of what the person whose legacy it is had demonstrated and represented, rather than around the execution of new plans toward new objectives. And the specific communication that Harley Quinn's continuation of the Joker's legacy was organized around was the communication that the death had not ended anything, that the specific claim the Joker had been making was not a claim that required his continued biological existence to be valid, and that the specific victories he had achieved were victories whose significance was not diminished by the fact that the person who had achieved them was no longer alive to observe their continued effects. The Joker-infected individuals of the Arkham Knight events were the most biologically specific expression of the legacy that the death had made available. The specific people whose blood transfusions from contaminated supplies had introduced the pathogen into their biology and whose subsequent transformation toward Joker-adjacent personalities had produced the specific population of individuals who embodied, through the mechanism of biological transmission, the specific claim that the Joker's perspective was not a private aberration but a transmissible one, a way of seeing the world that could be communicated through sufficiently intimate biological contact into other people's neurology, and through their neurology into their psychology, and through their psychology into their behavior. Each infected individual was a specific demonstration of the thesis. At the biological level, the evidence that the specific consciousness the Joker represented was not unique to the specific biological accident of the specific person who had first expressed it, but was rather something whose expression could be produced by the introduction of the right biological conditions into the right biological substrate, independent of the specific history and the specific formation that had produced the original. The multiplicity of Joker-adjacent personalities that the infection produced was not a dilution of the original, but an amplification of it, was the specific form that the thesis took when demonstrated not through a single individual's expression of it, but through the simultaneous expression of multiple variants of it by multiple individuals whose only shared characteristic was the specific biological modification that the infection had introduced, suggesting that the modification was sufficient on its own to produce the specific orientation toward the world that the Joker had embodied, regardless of the specific individual into whose biology it was introduced. The death was also, in the most direct and most personal sense, the Joker's final communication to Batman, the last and most complete expression of the specific argument that the entire relationship had been organized around making, addressed to the specific person for whom the argument had always been most importantly intended, and delivered through the specific mechanism of the ending of the relationship rather than through any further continuation of it. A living Joker making the argument was a Joker whose existence was itself available as a counter-argument, whose continued presence in the world and continued engagement with Batman was evidence that the relationship was ongoing, that the argument had not yet reached its conclusion, that the specific outcomes of the specific experiments were provisional rather than final. A dying Joker making the argument was a Joker whose dying was the argument, whose specific death in the specific circumstances that the Arkham City events had produced was the most definitive single expression of everything the argument had been building toward. the specific physical event that completed the philosophical demonstration that the life had been organized around constructing. The laugh, if that is what it was, in the final moment was the Joker's acknowledgement of this completion, the specific recognition, expressed through the specific register that had always been the Joker's preferred instrument of communication, that the thing that was ending had accomplished what it was for, and that the ending was therefore not a loss, but the final evidence of the accomplishment. Section 11. The philosophical victory. What the Joker proved about Batman's world. The accounting of the Joker's victories across the full span of the Arkham universe's documented history has assembled, across the preceding sections, a body of evidence whose scope and whose specific character deserve careful consideration before any conclusion is drawn from it, because the conclusions available from this evidence are not all equally supported by it, and the distinction between the conclusions that the evidence genuinely supports and the conclusions that the Joker would have preferred the evidence to support is a distinction that the honesty of the accounting requires acknowledging, even when that acknowledgement complicates the narrative that the victories themselves might seem to be telling. The Joker's thesis, stated at its most fundamental level, was that the moral architecture of Batman's world was a construction that the specific arrangements of value and commitment and institutional authority through which that world maintained its claim to be organized around, something real rather than something performed, were sustained by will and convention and the specific effort of people like Batman, rather than by any deeper structure of the world that would continue to support them if the will and the convention and the effort were removed or overwhelmed. This thesis had a strong version and a weak version, and the distinction between them matters enormously for any honest evaluation of what the evidence actually proves. The strong version was the claim that the construction was entirely arbitrary, that the specific values and commitments that organized Batman's project were no more grounded in anything real than any other configuration of values and commitments would have been, that the distinction between Batman's moral framework and the Joker's absence of one was purely conventional, maintained by the social preference of a majority that found Batman's framework more comfortable, rather than by any property of the framework that was independent of the majority's preference. This version of the thesis required the evidence to show not simply that the construction was fragile, but that it was hollow, that beneath the specific performance of moral commitment, there was nothing that the performance was, expressing other than itself. The weak version was the claim that the construction was vulnerable, that the specific arrangements of value and commitment and institutional authority through which the world maintained its claim to moral structure could be undermined by sufficient intelligence applied in the right places, that the order was imposed rather than inherent, that the maintenance of the moral framework required specific and costly effort rather than being the spontaneous expression of a world organized around the values the framework claimed to embody. This version of the thesis required only that the evidence show the specific costs and the specific vulnerabilities, the specific ways that the framework could be stressed, and the specific limits at which its maintenance became something other than what the framework claimed it to be. The evidence assembled across the preceding sections supports the weak version with a comprehensiveness and a specificity that is difficult to contest. Harley Quinn's transformation demonstrated that professional formation and intellectual sophistication provided no reliable protection against the specific kind of philosophical pressure that the Joker could apply to the right person, in the right circumstances, that the apparatus of therapeutic training designed to protect its practitioners from exactly the kind of influence that the Joker represented was insufficient to the specific challenge when the specific variables were configured in the way that the Joker's intelligence was capable of arranging. The Arkham Asylum takeover demonstrated that the most specifically relevant institutional expression of the claim that dangerous people could be managed through the institutional mechanisms of containment and treatment was insufficient to the specific challenge of containing the specific intelligence that its design had not anticipated. The blood infection demonstrated that the specific boundary between the Joker's presence and Batman's internal psychological space was traversable through the specific mechanism of biological infiltration, and that the traversal produced the specific consequences for Batman's psychological functioning that the Joker's understanding of Batman's psychology had predicted. Batman's choice at the end of Arkham City demonstrated that the rule had a limit, that the specific moral commitment most central to Batman's framework had a threshold at which its maintenance produced a moral compromise as significant as any the rule was designed to prevent. The Jason Todd situation demonstrated that the costs of the commitment extended beyond the person maintaining it to the specific people most directly in his care, whose specific vulnerability to the Joker's specific form of attack was itself partly a consequence of the specific constraints that the commitment imposed on Batman's operational methods. All of this supports the weak version of the thesis, with the comprehensiveness and the specificity that a rigorous evidentiary accounting requires. The construction was vulnerable. The vulnerabilities were real. The specific costs of maintaining the construction in the specific world that the Joker's intelligence created around it were specific and significant and traceable. The order was imposed rather than inherent, maintained by the specific effort of specific people at specific costs, rather than by the spontaneous self-maintenance of a world organized around the values the order claimed to embody. What the evidence does not support is the strong version. The strong version required the demonstration not simply of vulnerability, but of hollowness, required the evidence to show that, beneath the specific performance of moral commitment, there was nothing that the performance was expressing other than itself, that the values were entirely arbitrary, and that their maintenance was therefore entirely without genuine grounding. This demonstration was not produced by the full body of evidence, and the failure to produce it is not a minor omission but a fundamental one, because the strong version was the version of the thesis that the Joker needed the evidence to support in order for the philosophical project of his career to be genuinely complete. The weak version was interesting, and its demonstration was significant, but it was not the thesis, was not the specific claim that organized the Joker's understanding of himself and his project, and the relationship between his project and Batman's, because the weak version was compatible with the position that the construction was worth maintaining despite its vulnerability, that the specific costs of maintaining it were costs worth paying for the specific things that the maintenance produced, that the order being imposed rather than inherent did not make the imposing meaningless or the order valueless. The Joker needed the strong version to be true, because only the strong version justified the specific conclusion that the entire career had been organized around, arriving at and demonstrating the conclusion that the distinction between Batman's world and the Joker's world was purely conventional, that the specific values organizing Batman's project had no genuine claim over anyone not already disposed to accept them, and that the specific horror of what the Joker represented was therefore not a horror, but a liberation from a delusion that honest perception would recognize as a delusion. And the evidence does not support this conclusion, not because the evidence is insufficient in quantity, but because the evidence points, in its most honest reading, in a direction that the strong version requires it not to point. The communities that rebuilt themselves after the Joker's operations were evidence that the strong version did not account for evidence of the specific persistence of the human impulse to reconstruct the social arrangements that the Joker's demonstrations had exposed as vulnerable, an impulse whose existence and whose specific character were themselves evidence against the claim that the values organizing those arrangements were entirely arbitrary. Arbitrary values do not produce the specific quality of the impulse to reconstruct them after their destruction, do not generate the specific grief and the specific determination and the specific investment of effort and care that the rebuilding of social arrangements always requires of the people undertaking it. The fact that people rebuilt was not decisive evidence against the strong version, because the strong version could account for it as the expression of a different arbitrariness, the arbitrary preference for one configuration of social arrangements over another. But it was evidence that the accounting needed to acknowledge rather than ignore, because ignoring it was the specific kind of selective attention to evidence that the honest accounting of anything was designed to prevent. The relationship between the Joker and Batman was itself the most significant single piece of evidence against the strong version, the specific relationship whose character most completely undermined the conclusion that the strong version required. If the values organizing Batman's project were entirely arbitrary and their maintenance was therefore entirely without genuine grounding, then the Joker's specific orientation toward Batman, the specific quality of his attention to the relationship, the specific investment of his most sophisticated capabilities in the specific project of demonstrating the thesis through the specific mechanism of Batman's response to the demonstrations was also entirely arbitrary, organized around a preference for this specific opponent and this specific form of engagement that was no more grounded than any other preference. But the relationship had not the quality of arbitrariness. It had the quality of something that mattered to the Joker in a way that his own philosophical framework could not fully account for, something whose meaning was organized around the specific person of Batman and the specific form of Batman. The engagement with him, rather than being available to any opponent with sufficient capability to serve as a worthy experimental subject. The Joker needed Batman to be specifically. Batman needed the argument to be made to the specific person whose commitment to the specific framework was most complete and most sophisticated and most costly to maintain, because only the most complete and most sophisticated and most costly version of the commitment being shown to have a limit was evidence of the general truth that the thesis was claiming. This specific need was itself the evidence of something the strong version could not accommodate, the evidence that the Joker's philosophical project was organized around a relationship whose meaning was not arbitrary, whose specific character mattered in a way that the strong version's claim of universal arbitrariness could not account for without undermining the very basis of the claim it was making. If nothing mattered, the specific person of Batman as opposed to any other worthy opponent did not matter, and the Joker's specific orientation toward Batman as the necessary interlocutor for the argument was itself a form of commitment to a specific value, the value of making the argument to the right person in the right relationship that the argument itself claimed did not exist. This was the specific philosophical difficulty at the center of the Joker's project, and it was a difficulty that no individual victory, however complete, could resolve, because the resolution would have required the Joker to abandon either the thesis or the specific form of engagement through which he was demonstrating it, and either abandonment would have undermined what the project was for. The thesis could not be fully demonstrated, while the demonstration required the specific relationship with Batman that gave the demonstration its meaning, because the existence of the relationship with its specific quality of mattering was itself evidence against the thesis at its strongest and most necessary level. What the Joker proved about Batman's world was therefore not what the Joker claimed to have proved, but it was not nothing. He proved that the construction was vulnerable in ways that its architects had not fully accounted for, that the specific costs of maintaining it in the specific world that sophisticated opposition could create around it were higher than the maintenance's official description acknowledged, that the limits of the most committed and the most sophisticated expressions of the framework were reachable through sufficient intelligence and sufficient ruthlessness applied across sufficient time. He proved that the institutions organized around the maintenance of the construction were imperfect expressions of the values they claimed to embody, that the gap between the claim and the expression was real and exploitable and significant. He proved that the specific person, most completely organized around the maintenance of the construction, was a person whose maintenance of it had a limit, not the simple limit of a constraint that could be abandoned when the cost became sufficiently high. but the more complex limit of a commitment that could be shown, under the right specific circumstances, to produce in its most committed practitioner the specific moral compromise that the commitment was designed to prevent. He did not prove that the construction was worthless, or that the effort of maintaining it was futile, or that the values it expressed were entirely without grounding. He proved that they were worth fighting for. In the specific sense that the things worth fighting for are always the things that require fighting, that do not maintain themselves automatically, but require the specific, costly effort of specific people whose commitment to the ruse maintenance is genuine, and whose genuineness is demonstrated precisely by the cost they are willing to accept in the service of the maintenance. This was not the victory the Joker was working toward, but it was a victory in the specific sense that it was the outcome that the full body of evidence honestly assembled supported the demonstration, conducted across a career organized around the opposite demonstration, that the specific thing the Joker was trying to prove was not entirely provable, and that the resistance to the proof was itself the most significant evidence available about the nature of the thing whose vulnerability the proof was organized around establishing. Section 12. Outro. The accounting is finished now. The long and honest reckoning with what the Joker actually achieved, not the schemes, which were mostly stopped, but the victories, which were mostly not, has been conducted with as much specificity and as much honesty as the available evidence and the unhurried hours of this particular night permit. Let it settle. Let the weight of what has been assembled find the quiet that the assembled weight deserves here in the dark, in the specific stillness of a sleeping world that has not stopped being the world the Joker spent his career contesting, simply because the contesting has been acknowledged. The victories were real. The corrupted institution, the transformed person, the infected psychology, the rule shown to have a limit, these things happened, and they left marks that did not disappear when the immediate events that produced them were resolved, and the marks were the victories, more durable than any scheme, and more significant than any tactical outcome, and more honestly accounted for by the specific acknowledgement that they were what they were, than by the comfortable insistence that Batman stopped the plan, and therefore the Joker lost. But Gotham is still there, still turning in its specific darkness, imperfect and compromised, and carrying within its social landscape the specific evidence of everything the Joker demonstrated about its vulnerability. Still inhabited by people who rebuilt what the demonstrations had damaged, and who continue, with the specific costly effort that the maintenance requires, to maintain what the demonstrations showed could not maintain itself without the effort. The city's persistence is not a refutation of what the Joker proved. It is the specific form that the response to what he proved takes in the real and ongoing lives of the people who were required to continue living in its aftermath. Let Gotham sleep now. Let the arguments rest. Somewhere in its specific dark, the work of maintaining what the Joker's victories showed was worth the cost of maintaining continues, quietly and without ceremony, in exactly the way that the most important work has always continued, not triumphantly, but honestly and without stopping.